Il aime mieux pas lui donner une scène de plus puis partir en élection. Voyons. Bravo!
Another rowdy question period today as Liberals deal with the aftermath of voting against the old age security motion from the Bloc Québécois. The Bloc gave the Liberal government until October 29th to see this bill all the way through. Otherwise, it says it will pull its support for the government and possibly trigger a federal election. Now, the Bloc says it needs to see some clarity and some action by as early as next week. So how will the Liberal government respond? Government House Leader Karina Gould joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again, David.
So yesterday afternoon, Mr. Blanchet, he didn't move up the October 29th deadline completely, but he gave a clear indication they need a firm yes or a no. And the Deputy House Leader, Ms. Normandin, said pretty much the same thing. They need this by next week at some point. Will your government be in a position to tell the Bloc yes or no on old age security?
Well, David, as I said from the outset of this parliamentary session, I am in conversation with all of the House leaders from all of the different political parties, and I will continue to engage in those conversations to do my level best to make this Parliament work.
I know you're having those conversations behind closed doors, and my understanding is you and Mr. McKinnon, the Labour Minister, met with the Bloc House Leader and their seniors critic yesterday on this. But they are saying things in public about timelines. Can you meet those timelines? Is it reasonable to expect some clarity on where this goes by the middle to the later part of next week?
Yeah, well, as I've said before, I don't negotiate in public, and I will reiterate that, my job as the government House Leader is to speak with all of the opposition parties on a regular basis to try and advance issues that are important for all Canadians.
So how do you then interpret what Mr. Blanchet and Ms. Normandin said yesterday about next week? Do you interpret that as them saying they want a yes or no? Is that how you view it, or do you view it differently?
Well, I think they have been quite clear publicly. However, I think there are always opportunities to find ways to work together to support Canadians. And certainly, I think there is a possibility that we could find a way to support Canadians and Canadian seniors. But that is very much in the hands of the Bloc Québécois.
They said yesterday, Mr. Blanchet and Ms. Normandin, and I understand probably in your private meetings, that they're willing to negotiate on the process of implementation, getting things through Parliament, but not on the fundamental bottom line of the demand on the old age security, that they want what amounts to $16 billion over the next 5 years, and they're not prepared to budge off of that. Is that your understanding of what the bottom line is, that there is no wiggle room for that to change?
Well, as I said, I don't negotiate in public, and I don't discuss conversations. So I'm talking to everybody, and I'm open to having those conversations.
If the Bloc does follow through with what it's saying by the end of October, and Mr. Blanchet has said he could start the conversations as early as next week with the other parties on what to do, that puts a lot of pressure on the New Democrats and your conversations with Mr. Julian, I believe, on how to keep things going. Has any of this affected the pace and the intensity and the frequency of your conversations with the NDP?
No, I keep talking to everyone all the time, David. I have very busy days talking to lots of different people. And that's kind of how minority parliaments work, is that, my job is to talk to everyone. And, for example, the first week that we came back, we were able to get unanimous consent on C-76 for Jasper National Park. So, even in these fraught times, we're able to move important things forward for Canadians.
Right, and there's no magical way for me to phrase this question to get you to tell me whether you'll give the Bloc a yes or a no by next week, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right. I gotcha. So, I got to try. So let's move on to what is and is not happening in the House of Commons right now. There is a privilege issue being debated. There was a finding, that prima facie finding by the Speaker, that privilege had been breached because all of government, the Auditor General's office and others, had failed to turn over some documents that had been demanded by Parliament earlier in the year, pertaining to the Auditor General's findings into the what the Conservatives call the Green Slush Fund, the Sustainable Development Technology Fund. We heard from the RCMP Commissioner, Mike Duhem, today, because the intention of this motion is to compel the disclosure of the documents to Parliament and send it straight to the RCMP. He said they have what they need from the Auditor General. He said that today after testifying at the public inquiry into foreign interference. Does that in any way change what's happening in Parliament, the ability to move past this now that the head of the RCMP says they've got the evidence?
Well, I mean, David, it should, to be honest. I think what is completely alarming about what the Conservatives are doing right now is that they are using the extraordinary powers of Parliament that, the Speaker ruled that they have, but to do something that blurs the lines between the independence between the legislative and judicial branches of government. They're essentially using their privilege as parliamentarians not to access documents for their own use and for the study of parliamentarians, but to give them to a third party, and in this case, the RCMP. And the RCMP commissioner, when this first arose, said he had extreme discomfort with this because the RCMP has to abound by the charter and the rights and freedoms it provides to Canadians. And this is essentially a backdoor way for Conservative politicians to try to limit the rights of Canadians and to suspend their rights for their own political gain. I mean, it's absolutely unprecedented. And what the Speaker found, even though he said it was a question of privilege, what he instructed the Conservatives to do was to say, I will accept a motion that you send this to PROC for further study, because we don't have any precedent in Canada for doing this. Right. And so the question is, Parliament has these extraordinary powers, but should they use them? And what we're seeing in the House right now is even more baffling, because the Conservatives are now obstructing their own obstruction. Because they have a clear way to deal with this, which is to send it to PROC. But my suspicion is they don't want it to go to PROC, because what they would hear from experts, legal, parliamentary, procedural, judicial, police, is that what they are doing is completely inappropriate, and it's about trampling the rights of Canadians. So, I mean, what the Conservatives are doing right now is basically saying they are putting their partisan interests over top of the rights of Canadians.
So look, I think it's pretty clear from the findings of the Auditor General that what was happening with this fund was a mess. It was riddled with conflicts of interest, and money was being sent to companies without following the proper rules, and so much so that your government shut this thing down. But what's interesting is that Karen Hogan, the Auditor General, said she found no evidence of criminality, so she didn't report it to the RCMP. And the RCMP has said in writing that what they reviewed in the reports, they saw no evidence of criminality. But also, what the RCMP has said in a letter is that any documents obtained this way, they wouldn't be able to use in an investigation because it goes around the protections people have and it violates the charter. So even if everyone was to comply with this motion, the RCMP would have their hands tied and wouldn't be able to go any further if, in fact, they decide there's a criminal investigation here. That seems like this is a bit of a waste of time.
I mean, David, I don't think I could agree with you more on this. I mean, I think what the Conservatives are doing right now is, and the fact that they are filibustering their own amendment to this motion because they don't want it to go to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, because they know when it gets there, experts across this country are going to say, alarm bells, completely inappropriate, do not do this, do not trample the rights of Canadians, and do not blur the lines that are so important between legislative and judicial independence. The RCMP raised the issue of police independence. The Auditor General raised her own independence as an independent officer of Parliament. And so they don't want anyone to hear those arguments because they know that Canadians will be alarmed if they are learning of the fact that there are Conservative politicians who are trying to use their extraordinary powers to trample the rights of Canadians because of their partisan interests. And so what they are doing is just wasting the time, and not just the time. I mean, this is the taxpayers' money of Canada when we could be debating important pieces of legislation, we could be moving important things forward, but instead they are playing and not just political games, but dangerous political games with the rights of Canadians.
But it's not just the Conservatives, right? The Bloc and the NDP voted for this. So the Liberals are alone on this. I mean, the NDP like to say that they are the adults in the room. They must have a reason for doing this beyond just the partisan games you accuse the Conservatives of, because they have, in many ways, made committees work effectively throughout this Parliament. So how do you explain the fact that it's the other two opposition parties who also want it to be done this way?
Well, I think what we heard from the NDP and the Bloc is A, they were being bullied by the Conservatives, but B, that in their speeches, they also started to kind of realize what was going on because they talked about how unprecedented this was. They argued, that Parliament has the power to do it, and the Speaker ruled that they do, and we accept that. But the question is now, should they? And what the Speaker very clearly directed for Andrew Scheer, the House Leader for the Conservative opposition, is that he gave him a clear motion to say that this could be further studied at PROC so that Parliament could examine how and if this should move forward. And the Conservatives don't like that because it clearly indicates that they're going above and beyond what is appropriate. Even if they have the power to do it, is it appropriate? And they don't like that because it doesn't fit within their narrative. And so now they are filibustering their own privilege motion because they don't want to have a real discussion about this, because I can guarantee you that what we're going to hear from legal experts, judicial experts, the police, is that this should be a no-go, right? Parliament does have extraordinary powers, and it should have extraordinary powers, but it shouldn't be able to, well, it's able to, but the question is whether it should actually compel documents. And this isn't just, with regards to SDTC. The precedent that this sets is that any Canadian could have their charter rights trampled by a parliament that is, by parliamentary parties that are interested in advancing their partisan interests. And it's not just individual Canadians, it's any organization that the Conservatives have a vendetta against. I mean, this is extremely alarming. And I don't know about you or the viewers watching, but I imagine, and I can say for myself, I don't want to live in a country where Parliament is directing police investigations. I don't want to live in a country where politicians are deciding what they think police should say is criminal. That is an extremely dangerous precedent, and the Conservatives are absolutely playing with fire right now. Okay. And I think this, we need to be very alarmed, and we need to get this to PROC so that this can be discussed and parameters can be set so that we protect the very important charter rights of Canadians.
Okay, Minister, we're out of time. When you can speak more publicly on your conversations with the Bloc Québécois and where that's going, please come back. That's Government House Leader Karina Gould.
Thank you very much, David.
The Bloc Québécois says it could be ready to topple the Liberal government as early as next week. That's unless its demands are met, and the big one has to do with seniors. 2 years ago, seniors aged 75 and up got a 10% boost to old age security payments. Now, the Bloc Québécois wants to raise that benefit for the younger cohort, those aged 65 to 74. The boost would increase the maximum monthly payment from $718 to $790. That may not sound like much on a per-person basis, but it all adds up to a big number. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates it would cost the government an extra $16 billion over the next 5 years. Already, more is spent on elderly benefits than any other social programs, a cost of $80 billion this year alone. Canadians over the age of 65 are also among the wealthiest cohorts, with a median net worth of more than $500,000. Okay, some big dollar amounts, a big decision the government has to make, and we're going to talk about that with the Power Panel. Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister, finance in fact, which is relevant for this, and Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Good to see you all. Cameron, this is a lot of money that's on the table, a big decision to make in a pressure situation the government is facing. They probably can find $3 billion a year. Should they find $3 billion a year?
Or they might find some sort of compromise. There's a lot of bluster and big talking right now because of the pressure in Parliament. But I don't think it's sound policy. I mean, you laid it out well in the numbers that you put forward at the beginning in the intro. It's extremely expensive. The issue of our day, I like how Nate Erskine-Smith framed this. The issue of our day is generational fairness. It's also what the last government budget was all about. And making an investment this broad, this huge, to a lot of people who probably don't need it, not in a targeted way. It's not something that the government has done in most of its major investments in its time in office. So it's a really tough policy to see all parties in the House support. And I completely understand why the Liberals, or at least the vast majority of them, didn't support it.
James, what do you think happens here? It's a lot of money for a government that what I'm being told is they do want to actually stick to their fiscal targets this year of the deficit under 1% of GDP, declining debt to GDP over time, and not go over a $40 billion deficit. This makes that really tough, if not impossible.
I would genuinely much prefer that all political parties put forward their platforms in an election campaign and talk about the whole issue of seniors and retirement issues more broadly. I mean, we have a massive, bulge in our demographic reality. The cost of seniors, cost of living has gone up as a consequence of inflation, with their fixed incomes and fixed retirement costs have been blown sideways as a result of inflation, as a result of the cost of living pressures that we've seen. So rather than a government that's in the last year of its mandate desperately trying to hold on to power, being pushed around and bullied by the Bloc Québécois, who want an agreement that would only apply to Quebec but would have knock-on effects for the rest of the country, rather than desperately trying to hold on to power for a few more months and setting a precedent for the country long-term on a fiscal track that's unsustainable, how about we have an election campaign and all the parties come forward with clarity and a thorough policy agenda when it comes to seniors and their cost of living pressures for the foreseeable future. I think that would be a much more rational approach to this. Okay,
I do want to circle back on that, but Andrew, just on that, I mean, what do you make of this move, right? That the Liberals have never been shy about giving money directly to people and, changing their deficit targets, but they seem to be up against the limits of where they can go without jeopardizing credit rating. What do you think?
I'm not sure how much the credit rating will be at risk, but certainly the budgetary targets would be out the window potentially. It puts a lot more pressure on other things. I mean, I kind of like James's idea that, of course, the party should bring this forward, but all the parties other than the Liberals voted in favor of this just, within the last day or so in the House. It's an interesting political calculation that they're making. I mean, normally, because that older cohort votes in a larger percentage number, I mean, it's usually a safe spot to go and do what you can to encourage them to vote for your party. So it makes sense. But there's this question right now. There's so much debate about generational fairness, as Cameron's identified. It could very well work against them if you end up with for those parties, the Tories, the NDP, the Bloc, who have been supporting this. If you really are seen to be just moving your support over to where you think the votes are and not doing it on a point of principle, I think there's a real danger to that. We'll see.
Yeah. Satya, how do you think this plays, right? Because this has been the concern, the argument that generational fairness is an issue, like young people, millennials, Gen Z, really struggling, and like here's $3 billion a year more for the baby boomers, essentially, is a potential backlash there.
Well, the politics of this is actually very fascinating. Forget the potential, well, put aside the potential backlash from younger voters for a second, because I think it was Andrew who made the point that it's older voters who actually show up to vote at the most regular and consistent intervals. But the thing is about those 65-plus Canadians, when we talk to them and say, what is the top issue for you? They're not talking about cost of living for themselves. They're identifying housing affordability. They're identifying health care, access to health care. They're not, their houses largely are paid off. Their mutual funds have come in. They've been sitting on, on average, a 20-year run in the markets if they've invested. Things are generally okay. And yes, James makes the point that, look, there's lots of seniors in poverty. I'm not discounting that. But for the most part, you've got people who are not saying, and yes, who wouldn't like some extra money per month, but they're not saying that this is the #1 issue or problem for them. The politics are also very interesting among the conservative ranks, right? So the conservatives are on side with this. They've put themselves on side with this now. But, there's two things. There's a bit of dissonance among the conservative support base. On one hand, it does skew older. So, okay, the party maybe doesn't want to tick off that older base that will absolutely rock solid show up for them. But that base that skews older is also much more fiscally conservative and much more hawkish around things like deficits and government spending. And when you start to slice the data, it's those older conservative voters who are most likely to say, no, I'm sorry, this is not the most effective use of government spending. This may not be what we want. We want balanced budgets. We want smaller government. We want less of these types of transfers. We want more tax credits, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think this is going to necessarily drive those voters away from the Conservatives, because where else are they going to go? But, I do think there is maybe just a few millimeters of room for the Liberals to actually take a stand stand on this and say, we're not going to do this. We're actually going to not be hypocritical about it and stand up for the younger voters that we've said that we're here to show up for.
So James, this is your point about everyone put out their platforms and let's have an election. The Conservatives voted for this yesterday, and they have been against deficits and growing spending and saying for every new dollar of spending you need a dollar of cuts, which is a clear policy they have. I have been trying to find out, we've been trying to find out, if them voting for this, does that mean that this is something a future Conservative government will do? Because it's expensive and there's no clarity on that. What do you take? They sent us a statement that's after 9 years of Justin Trudeau, the usual sort of attacks, but not answering the direct question. How do you take this vote? Does this mean this is Conservative policy now?
Also supporting a Bloc Québécois motion in Parliament similar to this, right? So it's a 1-2 punch, right? The private members bill and the motion. So clearly saying, drawing a line in the sand, squaring off with the Bloc Québécois for senior voters. But taken together, these are basically 2 votes of non-confidence and status quo liberal sort of approach to things is how they would frame it. The details of what they would do as a government, they owe that to Canadians, and obviously they will have to come forward and answer those specific questions in an election campaign. This idea that Cameron talks about, though, about generational unfairness is very, very true, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think young people also realize that because of the pharmacological revolution, because the scare that we had of COVID and seniors being at risk of that, because of the living situation of a lot of seniors who are on fixed incomes and who are at risk, I think a lot of young people, they want to be able to be entrepreneurial and build businesses and grow and be forward-leaning and do all those things. But they're very mindful that we owe decency and respect and dignity to seniors in their sunset years, and we're living longer. Pharmacological revolution, the healthcare that we have, what we now know about nutrition, and living longer. So my point is that the generational unfairness argument, I don't think many seniors see themselves as taking from the pockets of the young, and many young see themselves as being victims of us being too dignified to seniors. I think these 2 cohorts can expect the government to be decent to both.
Cameron?
Yeah, James, you're absolutely right. And I mean, in no world are they mutually exclusive. I think the debate around this specific, it's a motion, it's not a binding thing, but it's about the broadness and the scope of it and how untargeted it is. It's going to go and how expensive it is. And right now, government has to make choices about where it's going to make investments and try and target those investments to people who need them most, especially in an environment where public finances are stretched and a lot of major programs have already been rolled out. Some of the things that the government has done for seniors in the recent past, have been more targeted to vulnerable seniors, to older seniors, as opposed to this. So I think there is, as Shachi said, dissonance in the Conservative position here. It's hard for them to square, but I think the calculus I see them making is they're extremely confident right now. They're expecting that most Canadians are not following the specifics of these motions in the House, and they're just trying to create as much chaos as they can and make it as hard as possible for the government to actually govern so that they can bolster their argument for an election being needed.
Andrew, I felt like I was watching that old movie I watched many times as a kid, Freaky Friday, where Jodie Foster and her mom bang into each other and they switch bodies for a day, because here are the Conservatives saying, we've always been there for seniors, voting for an increase in the OAS, adding $3 billion a year to the bottom line, and the Liberals saying it's too much money, we can't afford it, we need to stay on our fiscal track. And, the former Conservative government raised the retirement age to 75, to 67, Trudeau reversed it to 65. And it is unclear to me whether the Liberals will ultimately say yes to this, and if the Conservatives voting yes means they're going to do it should they win the next election. How do you view this? Is this just silly bugger in Parliament, or is this clear positions?
What? No.
I know. How dare I? How dare I suggest such a thing?
What are you thinking? But the other piece that I thought was curious is that, of course, the Tories have argued any of these kind of direct transfers to individuals are ultimately inflationary, right? That they're just going to go and spend the money and drive up costs on goods, as opposed to us all tightening our belts and helping bring the numbers down. So that too is a really curious thing. Of course, they opposed the CERB. They didn't want to give any money to those people who lost their jobs during the pandemic. But these folks deserve a raise. The politics of this are, fascinating. I'm kind of reminded of the, the Liberal slogan in 2015 about the middle class and those wanting to join it. This is the same thing now, just generationally. Those of us who aspire one day to be, young boomers, will be having this to look forward to. I'm not sure that it's the smartest move. I think that probably if the Liberals had countered with something to increase the GIS, which really does affect those seniors who are most impacted, that there would be a way for them to finagle their way out of this. But right now, it just looks very political.
Well, Shachi, I mean, look, it could just be posturing, but the Bloc seems pretty sincere, because everything I've heard is what they're saying publicly is what they're saying privately, that they'll negotiate on how to implement this demand, but they're not going to negotiate on the value of this demand. They want this. Seniors are a big voting bloc in Quebec. This is why we saw some 5 Atlantic Canadian MPs vote against the Liberals on this, because it also is in Atlantic Canada. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a compromise on the substance of the ask, at least not at this point.
No, and this is then where really the rubber hits the road for both the Bloc and the NDP. So when we ask Canadians, do you want an election right now? Do you want one right now? Do you want one in the next 3 months? 92% of Conservative voters are like, hell yeah, let's go right now, we're ready. The same cannot be said among Bloc voters or NDP voters, only about half of whom say, yes, let's go, let's have an election right now. So that is a consideration that both Jagmeet Singh and the leader of the Bloc have to take into account. Do they want to be the ones sitting there having to explain to their own bases, and particularly for the NDP, where you're dealing with 3 provincial elections at the moment, particularly close ones in Saskatchewan and in British Columbia, where it's like, hey, we know we just asked you to go out and do a bunch of stuff at the provincial level. Can you show up for us now a 3rd time in a general federal election? So the calculus of this starts to get very, very interesting. And yes, you can have the rhetoric, you can draw the red lines, you can say we're absolutely going to do it, but you don't know until you know.
So Cameron, I mean, you know this government the best of anyone on this panel, I would assume. Do you think they'll say yes to the Bloc to keep this going, or stare them down and then put all this pressure on Jagmeet Singh throughout the rest of this fall?
Possible prediction, David. I think they're gonna try and compromise behind the scenes. Like I just heard your interview with Karina Gould. My suspicion is that they're doing whatever they can with their counterparts to see if there is a compromise option available. At the same time, they're probably going to be looking at how they can squeeze the other parties on the substance of this policy to make it look as incoherent as possible for them to topple the government over this specific policy or come up with a solution of their own as a counteroffer. But it's a really fraught time in Parliament right now. And what I did really like in your interview with her is how she always brings it back to what ultimately most people would say they want Parliament to be doing. If they don't want an election, or if they're willing to wait a little bit longer for election, they would want Parliament to be working on important issues and actually getting the job done, as opposed to the back and forth and the fighting.
Okay.